So we have the skeptics' theories. The shroud image is a beautiful painting. Obviously, this comes from Walter McCrone, who published it in a magazine that he owned and edited called The Microscope. So he stated that the shroud's image was painted, as were the bloodstains, which were still red in color because they were made by red iron oxide pigment and not real blood. He claimed he found paint particles on the tape samples he examined. Stirp also reported finding pure red iron oxide particles on the shroud, but noted they were only visible through a microscope, scattered evenly across the shroud, and were likely the result of the flax retting process. Red iron oxide pigment was always made using cobalt, manganese, and other elements, but none of those were found on the shroud. The Stirp data clearly proved that the image was not formed by these particles. Now, this is something that a lot of people didn't know. Walter McCrone never even saw the shroud. He only examined the tape samples taken by Rogers and the Stirp team in '78 and only studied them visually using polarized light microscopy. He performed no chemical or spectral analyses on the samples. It is true that McCrone found a few actual paint particles on tape samples, but sadly, he failed to consider the 52 documented occasions when artists were permitted to sanctify their painted replicas by laying them onto the shroud and touching them, not only creating an official relic, but also causing an unintentional transfer of microscopic paint particles onto the shroud itself. And some of those copies still exist. In fact, I saw one in Portugal where in the corners of a copy that was made of the shroud, I believe from the Savoy family as a gift when Margaret married one of the Braganza princes of Portugal, and they gave him a copy of the shroud as a gift, sewn into the corners, all four corners of that replica or that copy were little bits and pieces of the shroud that the Savoy family had cut out from the shroud, sewed them in to make them official replicas. As I said, some of those painted copies still exist. And the most recently discovered one was found in 1999 in the monastery church in Bruma, Czechia. And the copy bears the Latin words extractum originale taken from the original, indicating it had been in direct physical contact with the shroud. Included with the copy was a letter dated 1651 and signed by the Archbishop of Turin verifying this. This provides a logical explanation for the discovery of a few small particles of pigment found scattered randomly across the Shroud of Turin. The blood on the shroud was confirmed as blood by spectrographic and chemical analysis. The results were published in the peer-reviewed journal, scientific journal, Applied Optics. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to get your work into Applied Optics. It's one of the most stringent journals out there. They're not very good at taking stuff that's in the slightest bit controversial. So the fact that they published the work by Heller and Adler is a pretty good testament that their work was sound. Of course, the major advancements in technology over the past 40 years would enable 21st century science to verify Adler's work with even more certainty should future testing ever be permitted. So look, it's 45 years later, basically, and the technology in many of these areas has advanced. So obviously another round of testing, similar to what Stirp did, but using the 21st century technology, could put to rest the skeptics' claims about some of the data Stirp collected by verifying it or not verifying it. Now, Shroud is a beautiful painting. Well, here we have one of Vern Miller's UV fluorescence photographs. And if you'll notice, there's a serum halo visible only with UV fluorescence photography around that spear wound in the side. This has been found around many of the blood stains. I don't believe it's on all of them, including some of the scourge wounds that are on the shroud. So this is another indication that it's not paint, because paint doesn't have serum that would come out from the particulate matter via capillarity. So why is the blood on the shroud still red? According to Alan Adler, Stirp blood chemist, victims of severe torture extending over many hours, like the man of the shroud, go into shock, and over time, their red blood cells start to break down. In these cases, their liver floods the bloodstream with bilirubin, which breaks down the red blood cells and releases hemoglobin. Adler reported finding high levels of bilirubin in the shroud blood he tested, and suggested that under these very rare circumstances, the blood would remain forever red. In recent years, this theory was tested by blood and DNA expert Dr. Kelly Kearse, who did not get the same results and did not reach the same conclusions as Adler. He did not claim that Adler was wrong, but points out that, again, 21st century science could answer those questions with more certainty. This is another reason why additional testing is needed to help answer the many questions that still remain unanswered. In some cases, the only honest answer is we don't know. I already said that. So Rogers did in-depth studies on linen and found an even more compelling reason for the red color of the blood. It is very likely that the shroud was washed in Saponaria officinalis soapwort, which was used somewhat like a fabric softener after the cloth was manufactured. This was typical of the ancient method of producing linen. Here's what Rogers determined. We found that Saponaria officinalis solutions are hemolytic. They break down the membranes of the red blood cells and release the red hemoglobin. Hemolysis is used to determine the hemoglobin content of blood. Whole blood darkens as it ages on the cloth. However, the blood spots on the shroud are still quite red after centuries of known history. Diane Saran, may she rest in peace, of Los Alamos, tested hemolysis on Saponaria washed cloth before we went to Turin. The blood is, and again, I'm quoting Rogers, the blood is still red on those 25-year-old samples, although the blood on the non-Saponaria washed control samples is black. This fact might help confirm that ancient technology was used to produce the cloth. It also proved it's not paint, it's blood. And this is the paper that describes, the SIR paper that describes the various stains on the cloth. And I'm just going to go into one section here. The chemists, and primarily I'm just going to read you that last part. No evidence was found in the body image of any added substances that could have contributed to the yellow color of the fibrils that form the image. The blood images on the cloth are made of blood. The data taken together do not support the hypothesis that the images on the shroud are due to an artist. Okay. The yellow fibers comprise the shroud image. This is a 64X photomicrograph made by Mark Evans. You can see the yellow coloring up here. You can see that just certain fibers are yellow, some adjacent fibers are not. Do you see any particulates, pigments, paints, binders? No, because they don't exist. And now we talk about the late world-renowned sacred artist Dame Isabel Picek, who stated, "The task of the arts merely and narrowly is to answer with authority only they can have. Is the Turin shroud a painting? The study of the support, ground, the paint mediums, and their related techniques in decay, handedness, right or left-handedness, style, directionality, light focus, art anatomy, and geometrical perspective, and experimental art all exclude that the object called the Shroud of Turin could be a painting." Highly respected art historian Thomas de Wesselo, a postdoc research associate at King's College at Cambridge, stated in his 2012 best-selling book, The Sign, accepting the carbon dating, art historians should have learned that Shroud is one of the most fascinating visual creations of the medieval period, a true masterpiece of devotion and imagery. Strangely, though, they have remained almost entirely silent. The reason is simple. The negative photo of on the cloth is the unmistakable sign that the shroud image could not have been created by a medieval artist. Technically, conceptually, and stylistically, the shroud makes no sense as a medieval artwork. The discipline of art history has had over a century to study the shroud since it was first photographed, and in all that time, no art historian has ever ventured to attribute it to a medieval artist. The spatial or so-called three-dimensional characteristics of the shroud image were first documented in 1976 by Stirp using the VP8 image analyzer prior to their actual examination of the cloth. This marked the first time this property was confirmed using a scientific instrument. Now, I want to add here that this was proposed back at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, that there might be depth or spatial information, but they had no way to verify it. And in my shroud photography lecture, part one of this series, I gave more information about that. But this marked the first time the property was confirmed using a scientific instrument. So up until 76, people proposed there might be this data encoded. It was the importance of the VP8 is it's the first time a scientific instrument actually confirmed that evidence. So the shroud image is the result of the image density being a function of cloth to body distance. In other words, where there was direct contact, the image is darkest. As the distance between the cloth and body increased, for example, where the hands crossed across the torso, lifted the cloth away from the torso, and you can see around the hands a halo where there's less image or more faint image around the hands because the distance had increased. This has been proven mathematically. Now, this is the VP8 analyzer. I like to show it to people, and I often used to say in my lectures, it kind of looks like an old stereo tuner, but today's audiences are so far away from stereo tuners, they don't even know what a stereo tuner is. And I might also add that I actually had a 10-year-old kid ask me if film was a USB device. So it's getting more and more difficult to explain to a younger audience that property of the, the negative reversal image on the shroud. This is the actual footage taken off the screen of a VP8. And this is what in 1976, the SERP team, let me clarify, the VP8 was not a NASA instrument. It was not used to map the moon. It had nothing to do with NASA. They had their own technology. This was, a VP8 was over at Sandia Laboratories, which is the sister lab to Los Alamos, also a weapons lab. Bill Modern, an X-radiography specialist, bought himself a VP8 to see if he could get more data out of his X-rays that he was making of classified stuff that he couldn't tell me about. And so Jackson and Jumper and Ken Stevenson and Don Devan, who's an imaging scientist, they were all there. And in 76, I had completed a 7-month consulting project as a photographic consultant for Los Alamos, working with Don Devan, and it was all about atomic bombs, and that's all I can say about it. And that's how I got involved. Don Devan called me up and said, hey, we just found that there's a correlation between image density and cloth to body distance on the shroud. And he said, we're going to put a team together. We need a photographer. Are you interested? And my response was no. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. But obviously I changed my mind the more I thought about that property. And as anybody who's heard me speak in the past knows, I also thought free trip to Italy. So this is the paper that deals with the three-dimensional characteristics. Again, these are all on shroud.com, and the links are in going to be on the YouTube page. And here are some of the conclusions. Frontal image on the shroud has a shading structure consistent with a body shape covered with a naturally draping cloth, and which can be derived from a single global mapping function relating image shading with distance between the two surfaces. So it's a very technical way of saying what I've already said. This interpretation would be a reasonable explanation for the shroud image if a high resolution mechanism satisfying all image and chemical characteristics of the shroud can be demonstrated. The visible image on the shroud is not the work of an artist in an eye-brain-hand coordination sense, nor does it appear to be the result of direct body contact or direct contact only, diffusion, radiation from a body shape or engraving, dabbing powder on a bas-relief, or electrostatic imaging. So even then, before all these theories that are more recent than the STERP work, they were already shooting holes in those theories based on the direct physical examination of the cloth that precluded those possibilities. The visible image on the shroud is probably not the result of a hot bas-relief, thank you, Joe Nickel, impressed onto the cloth, but such a mechanism might be able to account for the shroud's distance correlation, resolution, and chemical structure. So again, that's one possible thing. It does not seem to simultaneously account for the image residing on one side of the cloth, low contrast of the shroud image, or the lateral distortions in the shroud image consistent with draping a body over, draping the cloth over a body shape. So I think that pretty much precludes the shroud being a beautiful painting.